The official history of America is a story of numbers, population growth, economic output, territorial expansion. But there is another set of numbers, a chilling arithmetic that underpins a vast and silent chapter of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The number is 250,000. 250,000 children, loaded onto trains between 1854 and 1929, and shipped from the urban centers of the East Coast to the rural landscapes of the American West. They were sent to 47 states, Canada, and Mexico. The program was called the Orphan Train Movement, and it is presented as one of the great philanthropic endeavors of the age, a story of salvation. But when we examine the numbers more closely, the story begins to unravel. Let us consider the source, New York City. Historical estimates suggest that in the mid-19th century, the number of homeless, destitute, or vagrant children on its streets was somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 at any given time. In a city with a population that grew from roughly 500,000 to 1.5 million during this period, these children constituted a staggering 2 to 6% of the total population. The question this number forces upon us is not one of charity, but of origin. In an era of meticulous record keeping, of Bibles with family trees, of church christening records and municipal ledgers, how does a society generate a demographic crisis of this magnitude? Where did 250,000 orphans suddenly come from? The term orphan itself becomes a semantic problem. Historical analysis reveals that fewer than half of these children were orphans in the true sense of the word, having lost both parents. Many were half orphans, with one living parent. A significant yet unknowable number had both parents alive. Parents who were simply poor. Parents who were recent immigrants, struggling with a new language and a hostile economic environment. Parents who placed their children in an orphanage temporarily, as a form of social assistance during a period of illness or unemployment, fully expecting to retrieve them. They never could. The children vanished into the system, their parental claims dissolving against the bureaucratic machinery of child saving. This was not a simple act of rescuing children from the streets. This was a systematic relocation of a population the size of a major city. The central, disturbing question is not how they were saved, but from where and from whom they were taken. The official narrative is built around one man, Charles Loring Brace, founder of the Children's Aid Society. His philosophy, articulated in his 1872 book, The Dangerous Classes of New York, was that the urban environment was a corrupting influence. The only salvation for the destitute child was the wholesome moral influence of a rural, Protestant, agrarian family. He called his solution placing out. On the surface, the logic is compelling, a blend of Christian charity and social engineering. Brace's writings present a vision of rescuing children from Dickensian squalor and offering them a new life of fresh air and honest labor. But the accounts from the ground, from the children themselves and the local agents who received them, paint a starkly different picture. The benevolence of the Society's headquarters in New York dissolved on the long, grueling train journeys and evaporated completely on the station platforms where the children were distributed. These were not gentle introductions to loving families. They were public inspections. Children were lined up on stages in town halls or train depots, often after days of travel with inadequate food and sanitation. Prospective takers would walk the lines, inspecting them like livestock. They would check their teeth for signs of disease, feel their arms and legs for muscle to gauge their capacity for farm labor, and ask them to perform tasks or sing songs. The language used in correspondence and reports from the era is devoid of sentiment. Children are referred to as stock, shipments, or consignments. An agent in one Midwestern town wrote back to New York, "The last lot you sent were not very promising." This was not adoption as we understand it today. It was for the most part a system of indentured servitude. The older boys were taken for farm hands, the older girls for domestic servants. The pretty, healthy-looking toddlers were often the first to be chosen, while the sick, the physically disabled, or the unruly were often passed over, loaded back onto the train, and taken to the next town and the next. Brace's grand theory of moral uplift was, in practice, a commodification of human life, an efficient system for supplying cheap labor to the expanding frontier, disguised as an act of grace. The orphan train movement cannot be understood as a uniquely American phenomenon. To see it in isolation is to miss the larger, more disturbing pattern. During the very same decades, a parallel program of almost identical design was operating out of the British Empire. It was known as the British Home Children's Scheme. Between 1869 and the 1930s, Over 100,000 children were sent from Great Britain to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The organizations behind this, Barnardo's, the Fairbridge Society, used the exact same justification as Charles Loring Brace, rescuing children from the poverty and moral decay of industrial cities like London and Liverpool, and giving them a new start in the wholesome, agricultural colonies. The parallels are too precise to be coincidental. The British children, like their American counterparts, were often not true orphans. They were the children of the working poor, taken from families under economic distress. They were shipped across the ocean, often with their names changed and their pasts deliberately obscured. Upon arrival, they were paraded at depots and distributed to farms as laborers. The promise of adoption was rarely fulfilled. The reality was a life of hard labor, often accompanied by abuse and neglect. The contact with their families back in Britain was systematically severed. What we are looking at is not two separate, national charities. We are looking at a coordinated, ideological movement spanning the Anglo-Saxon world in the late. It was a mass redistribution of human capital, moving the surplus children of the urban poor from the crowded industrial centers to the labor-starved agricultural peripheries of the English-speaking empires. It was a form of social engineering on a global scale, rooted in the Malthusian fears of overpopulation and the eugenicist beliefs about the dangerous classes. This was not about saving individual children. It was about managing a demographic problem and fueling colonial expansion with the most vulnerable and cheapest form of labor available. The orphan trains were simply the American theater of a much larger international operation. To successfully relocate 250,000 people and ensure they never reconnect with their past, you need more than trains. You need a bureaucratic mechanism of erasure. What these children experienced was a process that can only be accurately described as a paper genocide. It is the systematic destruction of a person's legal and historical identity through the manipulation, sealing, and destruction of official record. It is a quiet, bloodless form of extermination, not of the body, but of the self that was. Process began the moment a child entered the system. Their given name was often deemed too foreign, too ethnic, or simply inconvenient, and was changed to something more Anglo-Saxon. Surnames were erased entirely, replaced by the name of their new host family. Birth dates were frequently altered or fabricated, making it impossible for them to ever accurately trace their origins. The children were explicitly forbidden from speaking about their past or attempting to contact their biological families. This was enforced as a condition of their placement. Any mention of a mother in New York could be grounds for punishment or removal. The message was clear: your past does not exist. You were not born, you were placed. The institutions that orchestrated this, like the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital, became the gatekeepers of identity. They held the original intake records, the slivers of truth that contained a child's birth name, parents' names, and last known address. But these records were not for the children. They were sealed. For decades, descendants seeking information were told that the records were sealed to protect the privacy of the birth parents, or that no records existed. In many cases, they were told the records had been lost to fires or floods. This systematic sealing of archives created a genealogical brick wall, a deliberate severing of the branch from the tree. This was not accidental negligence. It was a policy. A paper wall was constructed between the child's present and their past, a wall as real and as impassable as any physical barrier. The person they were born as was legally and historically executed, and a new identity, a blank slate, was issued in their place. Every act of large-scale social engineering leaves a data trail. To understand the origins of the 250,000 children on the orphan trains, one would need a detailed demographic snapshot of the United States during the peak years of the movement. One would need the single most important genealogical document of that era, the U.S. Federal Census of 1890, and it is precisely this document that does not exist. The 1890 census was a landmark. It was the first to use electric tabulating machines, invented by Herman Hollerith, allowing for an unprecedented level of data collection. It asked new, highly specific questions about immigration, naturalization, language spoken, and family structure. It was designed to capture, in minute detail, the state of the nation during the height of European immigration. It would have contained the names, addresses, and family compositions of the very immigrant communities in cities like New York, from which the vast majority of the orphans were taken. It was the key, the master document that could have connected hundreds of thousands of descendants back to their true origins. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., where the 1890 census records were stored. The official story is that it was an accident caused by a stray cigarette or faulty wiring, but the circumstances are profoundly suspicious. The records were not in a proper archive, they were in a vulnerable, unsecured basement. More damningly, the fire occurred just one day before the records were scheduled to be moved to a new, state-of-the-art, fireproof vault that had just been constructed for the National Archives. 25% of the records were destroyed outright by the fire. Nearly all of the remaining records were so severely damaged by water and smoke that in 1934, Congress authorized their complete destruction. Of the 62.9 million lives enumerated, only a few thousand fragments survive today. It is a genealogical cataclysm, a black hole in the heart of American history. One cannot prove arson, but one must ask the question: was the destruction of the one document that could have exposed the true origins of the 250,000 displaced children merely a tragic coincidence? Or was it the final, decisive act of the paper genocide, the incineration of the evidence? The trains stopped running in 1929, but the silence they created continues to this day. It is estimated that over 2 million Americans are direct descendants of the orphan train riders. For them, history is not a continuous line, but a void. Their family tree has no roots. They are the inheritors of the paper genocide, living with the genealogical and psychological consequences of that systematic erasure. Their history begins on a train platform in the Midwest, with a new name and a fabricated birthday. Before that, there is only fog and speculation. This massive social experiment was covered by a pervasive mythology, a cultural narrative designed to obscure the uncomfortable truth. The concept of the orphan became a convenient fiction, a way to avoid confronting the reality of mass child removal from poor and immigrant families. The folklore of the Cabbage Patch Kid, which became popular in the following decades, speaks to this psychological need for a story that erases the trauma of origin. Children are not taken, they are found. They have no messy, inconvenient past. They simply appear, ready for a new life. This myth is the soft focus lens through which a society can view an act of profound violence without acknowledging it as such. We are left not with answers, but with the haunting weight of the questions. Were the orphan trains a grand humanitarian act, or were they a ruthless instrument of social policy, designed to break the cultural and familial bonds of immigrant communities deemed undesirable? Was the goal to provide homes for children, or to provide labor for an expanding nation? And was the destruction of the 1890 census a bureaucratic blunder, or the final brilliant stroke in a 75-year campaign to ensure that the truth would be turned to ash? 2 million Americans today do not know whose blood flows in their veins, not because their ancestors were forgotten, but because the records of their existence were deliberately, systematically, and successfully destroyed. The silence that remains is the true legacy of the orphan trains, a testament to a century erased.